Now for a sermon that I'm calling Four Direction Resurrection. When our daughter Loretta was at Cornell, she took a course called Memory and the Law. And one basic takeaway from that course was that eyewitness accounts are just not reliable. There are many scientifically researched reasons, but the fact is that eyewitness accounts are very subjective, and memory is subjective. We perceive things and remember things according to our age, our experience, culture, gender, emotional state, what happens right before or after the incident, and the list goes on. Well, in the New Testament, we have four gospel books, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, written as eyewitness accounts of what happened in Jesus's life. But guess what? There are four completely different stories about what happened on the day of the resurrection of Jesus. John just read us about the Gospel of Matthew. There were two women, Mary Magdalene and another Mary, who went to look at the tomb, and they encountered a violent earthquake with an angel coming from heaven, rolling back the stone from in front of the tomb and sitting on it and telling them not to be afraid, and paralyzed guards and women running to tell the disciples and meeting Jesus on the road, who also tells them not to be afraid. So in the Gospel of Matthew, we have two women, one earthquake, one angel, guards paralyzed with fear, and the resurrected Jesus telling the women not to be afraid. Well, in the Gospel of Mark, the story is really different. Three women with spices, no earthquake, a young man sitting inside of the tomb, not on the stone, telling them not to be afraid, that Christ has risen and that they should go tell the disciples to meet Jesus in Galilee. The women run away and tell absolutely nobody. And then we have the story of the resurrection in the Gospel of Luke. Lots of women, not one, not two, not three, lots, with spices, stone already rolled away. Two men, we think probably are angels, standing in dazzling white garments, asking them a question. Why do you seek the living among the dead? He has risen. And so the women run and they tell everybody, but nobody believes them. And finally, in the Gospel of John, one woman, Mary Magdalene, goes to the tomb. The stone had been removed. She stands there weeping with grief and sees two angels seated where Jesus's body had been. And then she turns around and she sees Jesus standing there. And he asks her, "Why are you crying?" But she thought he was a gardener. So she said, "Well, where is Jesus's body? I want to prepare it for burial." And Jesus calls her by name. He says, "Mary." And she recognized his voice and she said, "Teacher." And Jesus said, "Don't hold on to me. I have not yet returned to the Father, but go and tell my disciples that I am returning to God." So she runs and tells the disciples, "I have seen the Lord." So the Gospel of John, one woman, two angels, and Jesus, who spoke only to Mary, who ran and told the disciples. Now, I'm going to give you three multiple choice questions to see if you can tell the difference. First of all, how many women went to the tomb? One, two, three, more, or all of the above? All of the above. How many angels were at the tomb? One, two, or all of the above? You got it. How many eyewitnesses ran to tell others? 0, 1, 2, or all of the above? Yes. All four gospel resurrection stories are different, but they have two things in common. beloved friends went to the tomb of Jesus, and his dead body was not there. So, which of the resurrection stories is true? Matthew, Mark, Luke, or John? Well, my Bible professor in graduate school, Dr. Richard Henshaw, would have said to me, if I had asked him that question, he would have said, Ms. Dolch, you are asking the wrong question. Because the question is not which gospel resurrection story is true. The question in my mind is not even, is the Christian resurrection story true? Rather, I like these questions better. What does the story of Christ rising from the dead mean? What is this archetypal story about? And how does this story affect our attitude about our living and our dying? And a question for today, what hope and inspiration does this resurrection story offer us during the coronavirus pandemic? I believe that one reason that we have 4 different stories in the Bible about the resurrection of Jesus is that everyone experiences the reality of resurrection according to our own perspective. Does that diminish the power of this story? I don't know about you, but for me, it makes it even more powerful. A couple of weeks ago, I talked with you about a Native American concept of 4-direction thinking. I'll tell that again, what this speaker said. He said, you can't say that you know a mountain, and unless you have walked all the way around the mountain and seen it from the north and the south and the east and the west, until you have walked up the mountain and experienced it from the top, until you have studied the plants and animals on the mountain and experienced it as their home. See, the New Testament gives us 4-direction resurrection from the perspectives of the 4 gospel writers. For me, resurrection is a mystery of how something can appear dead or totally demolished and then reappear in a different way, revitalized, life force returned, available to us. For me, as a person of faith, resurrection is a divine mystery in which the story of Jesus points out that life on this earth, as we see it and know it and experience it, is not all that there is. There's more. People react to this story in a different way. Like the disciples in Luke, some people think it's nonsense. Like the women in Mark, some of us are terrified at the thought of mystery and don't want to think about it. And like the women in John and Matthew, some of us run out and tell everybody we know when we experience a spiritual mystery. But here's the thing. All of us are eyewitnesses to resurrection, but we all experience it in different ways. So I want to look at resurrection with the idea of 4-directional thinking. That there is a biology of resurrection. There is a psychology of resurrection. There is a physiology of resurrection. And it is a faith story. So first of all, let's look at, there's a biology of resurrection. We all know that a butterfly does not start off as a butterfly. First, it is a caterpillar that builds a cocoon around itself. And within this dead-looking cocoon, it becomes a butterfly. But did you also know that the caterpillar doesn't just grow wings and shrink into the wings and body inside of that chrysalis? It turns to mush, to goo. It dissolves. It is liquid. Every caterpillar thing about it in a sense, dies and then reforms. And even in the New Testament, St. Paul writes about how a seed has to go into the ground and die before a plant can live. The resurrection story is a mysterious truth about how the natural world is put together, constantly regenerating itself. There is a biology of resurrection. There's also a psychology of resurrection. A friend of mine woke up the other morning hearing sirens and looked out of her window downtown and saw police cars with lights and sirens on either side of Cornell to New York buses, which had stopped running. What could be happening, she thought. And later, she went to the newspaper website and found that 2 busloads of medical workers from our little town had volunteered to go and help out in New York City for a month during this pandemic. And that Ithacans had lined the streets and made posters and waved and thanked them and had a police escort out of town. When my friend heard this news, she burst into tears at this outpouring of love, of people risking their lives to help people they don't even know. So touching. It's a resurrection story of how we can transform our despair and our powerlessness into loving and selfless action. There is a psychology of resurrection that is so precious and that all of us experience in our lifetime. This great mystery, this cosmic mystery, gives me great hope about what's happening in this era of COVID-19. And we pray that this world brought to its knees by an invisible virus can somehow be transformed, brought back to life in a new way, more equitable, more aware, more humble, more committed to racial justice, and more ecologically sensitive, more unified. Resurrection is a social and a psychological story. A third dimension is that resurrection is a physiological story. It is a healing story, one like Jaden talked about this morning about her dog. Well, years ago, some of you may have known Art Culp, a member of St. Paul's United Methodist Church. He experienced a really serious stroke. Most of his body was paralyzed, no speech, almost no movement. He spent time in the hospital and then he was moved to rehab in Cortland to finish his last days. Fast forward 6 months later, Art Culp walks into the church. He walks up the stairs unassisted. He walks to the sanctuary door and he sings. This is the middle of July. He sings, "Christ the Lord is risen today." And he says, "I don't know how it happened. It's a miracle. I have experienced resurrection in my own body." Christ's resurrection story is a healing story. It's a nature story. It's a story of the heart and the unified community. And finally, resurrection is also a faith story. I've told this story many times, but it's just so precious to me. Like Jen was saying about remembering those who have gone on before us. In 1994, my oldest brother, Kelly, died. He had had cancer for 11 years. Our whole family was gathered on the 6th floor of Duke University Hospital to say goodbye. And after he passed, all 15 of us, 8 children and 7 adults, we all met with the chaplain and then in a daze crowded onto the elevator to go home. You know how tense that kind of time is. People crying or trying to hold it together or numb, stunned, kids feeling really awkward. We were all devastated in one way or another. Kelly had 3 teenage boys, and one of them all of a sudden let out a huge bodily sound, if you know what I'm saying. And all 15 of us just burst out laughing hysterically. We were just crazed with laughter. By then, the elevator had gotten to the 3rd floor, and the elevator door opened, and we were all out of control with laughter. And the people who had hoped to get on the elevator said, "We'll take the next one." So our family of 15 finally landed in the lobby. We were hugging and crying and laughing and talking about the next things we had to do when the elevator door opened again. And a lady who had not gotten on our elevator at the 3rd floor came over to my brother Jim, and she asked him this question: "Has there been a birth?" And my brother Jim looked at her and said, "Yes, yes, there's been a birth." The exquisite story of Easter is about this: that no matter what happens, illness, pandemic, sociological transformation, disappointment, different perspectives, sorrow, suffering, loss, change of seasons, growth of flowers, death of caterpillars, death of brother or parent, no matter what happens, we as people of faith believe that there is an answer to the question, will there be a birth? And for all of us crazy people who know about nature and the heart and healing and community and faith, we have one crazy answer. Yes. We don't know what it's going to look like, but yes. And that's the good news of the gospel. As we share this Easter in pandemic exile, and yet maybe united as never before, we share this great resounding yes. So now I invite Janet, if you would put our closing hymn up on the screen, and as we sing this hymn that says, "God, yours is the glory, risen, conquering Son, your victory is an endless yes." Let us sing together.
Be the glory, risen, conquering Son, endless is the victory thou o'er death hast won. Angels in bright raiment rolled the stone away, kept the folded grave close where thy body lay. Thine be the glory, risen, conquering Son. Endless is the victory thou o'er death hast won. Lord Jesus meets thee, risen from the tomb. Lovingly he greets thee, scatters fear and gloom. Let the church with gladness hymns of triumph sing. For our Lord now liveth, death hath lost its sting. Thine be the glory, risen, and conquering song, and thus is the victory thou o'er death hast won.
Well, this is a time in history we'll never forget. It's a time of great testing of all the dimensions of our lives as people on earth. Huge cataclysmic change and fear and anxiety and everything. But here's what we are called to do as we go forth into this day. This is our calling as people of the Christian faith. And that is to answer the question, will there be a rebirth? With a resounding yes. And to hang on to that yes with every fiber of our being. And to align our lives with that answer. Our lives, our money, our decisions, our policies, the way we live. To let that yes lead us. So have a blessed and wonderful rest of your Easter morning. Thank you all for being here together, gathered as a community of faith.